Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 7th week of 2013. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. We're coming to you at a slightly late hour tonight, normally at 7 p.m., 10 p.m. this evening, and on the repeats. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news has been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is February 15th. On this day in 1898, the United States Navy battleship USS Maine exploded and sank in the harbor in Havana, Cuba, killing more than 260 people and precipitating the Spanish-American War. On this day in 2003, the largest anti-war rallies in history took place. Millions of people around the world, approximately 800 cities, took part in protests against the impending U.S. invasion of Iraq. So you're watching News from Neptune, the War Lies edition. And Ron Szoke will find the first weapon of mass destruction.
Well, the only war I'm going to allude to today, I think, is the supposed war on poverty, which has, of course, been lost by the poor. But let me mention 4 points, trying to be a little more coherent today than I've been in the past sometimes. First, I will mention a
Make it
piece
toughing on the rest of us.
about wage theft in Chicago. This is from the blog of the Protestants for the Common Good. They published something called the Common Good News. And this is by Reverend C.J. Hawking, who writes that in January, Arise Chicago, a 22-year-old interfaith group that seeks to bring a fuller measure of God's justice to the workplace, witnessed its groundbreaking wage theft ordinance pass unanimously through the Chicago City Council. Now, if a business owner is found guilty of wage theft, the business license could be revoked. If effective July 1st, Chicago joins San Francisco as the only two U.S. cities with such an ordinance. Low-wage immigrant workers are most often the victims of wage theft, which occurs when people are not paid the proper minimum wage, overtime, or not paid at all, which often happens in the case of the supposed illegal immigrants who work for a week or two and then told, buzz off, we don't want to see you again. You don't get paid anything, and if we do see you again, you'll be reported to the police. Well, of course, they can't go to the police. A 2010 University of Illinois at Chicago study reported that in 1 week, $7.3 million is stolen from low-wage immigrant workers in Cook County. Over $1 million a day is stolen from the very people who need it most. So other figures are cited here. I realize that the facts and figures approach is very tedious, but to make this more concrete, another worker, Anna, is owed $9,400 from a bridal shop in one of Chicago's mega malls where small businesses rent stalls. Anna has learned that most of the 200-plus mall workers are paid $8 an hour. With the new ordinance, Arise Chicago and the faith community now have greater leverage to advocate for these workers to be paid fairly. A 2012 study by the University of Illinois Labor Education Program revealed that car wash workers in Chicago have an average of $4,413 stolen from them annually, about 1/3 of their wages. Here are the ways that people of faith and others can make a difference. Put cash tips into workers' hands, not in a jar or on a credit card statement. There are a lot of employers who just flatly steal those supposed tips. Pay your workers fairly, support businesses that pay workers fairly and legally. Ask questions of contracted businesses before you hire them, and join Arise, Protestants for the Common Good, and Raise Illinois in advocating for a minimum wage increase, perhaps of the kind advocated by Governor Quinn last week. The next piece is also from the Protestants for the Common Good newsline, called A Wage You Can Live On. Governor Quinn said it first: nobody in Illinois should work 40 hours a week and live in poverty. Then President Obama followed a week later in his State of the Union address: even with the tax relief we've put in place, a family with 2 kids that earns the minimum wage still lives below the poverty line. And I believe you, David, cited something showing that someone working for the minimum wage, 40 hours a week, could not afford the minimum cost of a 2-bedroom apartment in any city in the country.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So this says that PCG has worked diligently over the past 2 years with others in Raise Illinois, the minimum wage coalition, to raise the minimum wage in Illinois. We've talked about this issue at press conferences, in church education sessions, and in this publication. Surely we've said everything that needs to be said, but a lot of people who should be getting the minimum wage are not, because the money is being taken from them in various devious ways. The last increase in the Illinois minimum wage was July 1st, 2010, when the wage went up 25 cents to the current $8.25 an hour. So, ironically, the federal poverty level has gone up each of the past 3 years, but the minimum wage has not. Minimum wage workers are slipping farther into poverty. So, it's difficult to get, I think, to get employers to see that when those people have more money in their pockets, they will be buying more stuff from the employers, but they don't look at it that way. They keep claiming that, contrary to the evidence and analysis that has been presented over and over again, that increasing the minimum wage will decrease employment opportunities. So Governor Quinn has advocated raising the Illinois minimum wage to $10 an hour, I believe, and President Obama the national minimum wage to, what was it, $9 an hour, I believe. On the front page of today's local newspaper, report: child poverty tops 20% in the county. Organization says the rate has doubled in the past 12 years. The child poverty rate has nearly doubled in 12 years, growing from 12% in 1999 to 23% in 2011. And here are some of the figures for Champaign County and also for Vermilion County, the Danville area. The median income for families with children, adjusted for inflation, 1999 to 2011. The income in Champaign County declined 10%. In Vermilion County, declined 31%. There are these older industrial towns like Danville and Decatur that are in very serious trouble. Children's enrollment in Medicaid and related assistance programs, Champaign County increased by 45% in that period. In Vermilion County, increased by 29%. State-funded preschool spots lost in the same interval, 2009 to 12. Champaign County 12%, Vermilion County 26%, statewide 12%. Low-income student enrollment in the 2011-12 school year, Champaign 56%, Urbana 67%, Danville 76%, statewide 49%. But we tend not to realize, ordinary middle-class people who are neither rich nor poor, just how much poverty there is, especially in Urbana, which is really shocking to me when you start finding out the facts. So there it is. Finally, a look at this piece by Thomas Edsall in the New York Times, January 30th. The hidden prosperity of the poor. Conservative and right-wing economists like to argue that life for the poor and the middle class is better than it seems if we just look at income and possession figures. Those economists like to argue that products and services keep getting cheaper and cheaper and better with greater variety. And so the poor, those on welfare, have really nothing to complain about. And indeed, we keep getting from those people stories like those we got from the late Ronald Reagan, that there are these welfare queens out there who are buying T-bone steaks and driving Cadillacs. And that is a fiction. It's a fraud. And but we don't hear any complaints about this. So some conservative economists say that this is the standard left-wing critique of capitalism. Economic growth does not serve all classes of society, and so on, which I believe is certainly true. The problem is distribution and not economic growth. These economists, conservative economists, argue that liberals are asking the wrong question. They point out that according to data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey compiled by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the disposable income of these people in the poverty group has actually been increasing relatively. So these conservative analyses, Mr. Edsall says, have drawn heated criticism. My colleague, Paul Krugman, at the New York Times, was harsh in his assessment of the conservative paper. It's, in short, he says, a complete non sequitur and scathing in his view of Hassett's qualifications. The co-author of Dow 36,000 doesn't exactly have a reputation to destroy. So there's talk now about the increase in income inequality, whether that has been accompanied by an increase in consumption inequality. And some people are trying to shift the focus to consumption inequality. And they say that that is lower than it's been for a long time. So David Autor, an economist at MIT, wrote in an email to the Times that the real danger is that the United States, which is not an economically mobile society by Western standards, is going to become more dynastic. And already, gradient between household income and college attendance has steepened substantially between cohorts born in the early 1960s and those born in the early 1980s. Since educational attainment is the key predictor of lifetime earnings, this suggests that the link between circumstances at birth and lifetime incomes will be magnified in the current generation relative to the earlier one. Mm-hmm. In excess, Edsall says, inequality becomes dangerously destructive. So he goes on to quotes Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz again, whom I've quoted here a number of times. The inequality itself is one of the reasons for the economic slowdown. It's partly a consequence of the global economy's deep ongoing structural changes. An economic and political system that does not deliver for most citizens is one that is not sustainable. In the long run, eventually faith in democracy and the market economy will erode, and the legitimacy of existing institutions and arrangements will be called into question. So this begins to look or sound suspiciously like class conflict, but that, of course, is that kind of talk is forbidden in the American media. The September 2012 on income and poverty, released by the United States Census, provides the left with additional ammunition. Edsall says it found that the household income in 2011 fell 1.5% to its lowest level in 16 years, to $50,054. Most arresting, the gap between the incomes of rich and poor expanded further than it had at any time in the past 40 years. So redistributive conflict is the essence of politics, as Esso says. And again, what are we to make of this? Again, you'll find people quoting those figures and facts and statistics that please them, arranging them and choosing them and arranging them in ways that are pleasing to them, and in that way hoping to create enough confusion to prevent you from drawing what seems to me the obvious conclusion from these facts and figures.
Thank you, Ron. What do you think, David? Has there been treason in the war on poverty?
Yeah, at the very start you talked about how the war on poverty was being won by or being lost. I guess one way of looking at it is it's being won by the poor people who are still poor. Yeah. But anyway, not to make light of that. Yeah. The questions that arise have to do with how, if we were to redistribute income or alleviate poverty, how would we go about doing that? Yeah. The minimum wage, raising the minimum wage is one of them, and certainly the minimum wage hasn't kept up with the level of inflation, and should be, given in the 1960s terms, it probably should be $12 or $13 an hour instead of the $8 an hour that it is. So even Obama's proposal, which I guess is calling for a raise to $9 an hour, is pretty inadequate, if not pathetic. Other things that might be thrown in have to do, going back to the idea of the minimum national income, which was actually proposed by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, not one of my favorite human beings of all time, during the administration of Richard Nixon, also not one of my favorite human beings of all time. But they did that in an era in which, interestingly, they were thinking differently about what might alleviate poverty in the context of a national uprising of the poor. So think of it in that context and as a response to that context. Beyond that, one thinks about providing the services that the poor needs, and they are getting medical services, Medicaid services, but providing the services that will improve their quality of life. I mean, what the conservatives try to argue is that if you value the medical care that's given to the poor, then they don't look so poor. There's some truth to that, but it has to be more than that. It has to be. It has to somehow translate into the standard of living which they're able to maintain, other than simply going to receive medical care. So the question becomes one of transferring wealth, not just raising wages, but transferring wealth, and not just raising wages, but organizing unions to raise wages in a substantial way. Yeah. So there are many ways of looking at this, from kind of the liberal to the left. Yeah.
A graduated income tax, going back to the Eisenhower levels, for example, would be a first step. But of course, none of these are a complete solution, which will quickly be pointed out that it's not definitive.
One on a low flat tax and a wealth tax.
Yes.
That
would help also.
The Internal Revenue Code now, I'm told, it runs twice the number of words as the King James Version of the Bible. Yeah. A lot of people spend a lot of money. I mean, a lot of people get a lot of good work spending time working their way through that code for people without enough money people who have enough money to save from that sort of work. A low flat tax is clearly a consummation devoutly to be wished for most Americans, but then you say that doesn't produce enough money. That's quite right. Why not, instead of borrowing the money from rich people, as the government does right now, that's what deficit spending means, tax them. To tax investable income, not the income that you need to live with, need to live on. But I've quoted this line from for some time on the numbers about the deficit, that a 15% emergency tax on investable income, that's not your net worth, that's the money you have in the stock market, basically, 15% tax on the money you have in the stock market over $1 million. You get the first million to play the stock market on your own. But a 15% tax on the money over $1 million that you're using to pay the stock market would make the deficit disappear. Yeah. And 99% of Americans would not be affected by the tax because, of course, 99% of Americans don't have more than $1 million in the stock market and or of investable income. But it seems to me that even talk about graduated tax, which, as you say quite rightly, Ron, are quite reasonable, doesn't get at the problem of redistribution in a way that you're talking about. If you don't have a tax regime that in fact will redistribute wealth, then you're just going poor at a lesser rate. In fact, we've been going poor at a great rate. Yeah. Wages in this country have been essentially flat since 1973, and in the same time, the concentration of wealth has been accelerating. That is, the concentration in the upper quote, close quote, levels has been growing, in fact. And what we're talking about here is nothing less than class struggle. That's the reason we don't want to talk about it. It is a conscious policy that has been given the name neoliberalism to take back the wealth that the welfare state after World War II was called upon to produce, and put it in the hands of the 1%. The only way to get it is to tax it back.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of things, that can be done along those lines. Taxing capital gains at the standard rate, carried interest, this stuff that the investment people play around with, a number of minor things that could be done short of rioting in the streets.
But the possibility of rioting in the streets, seems to me shouldn't be written off. It was Frederick Douglass's birthday this week, I think, and he's responsible for the line that power concedes nothing without a demand. Yeah. And it's in fact the quiescence of Americans that has been the remarkable achievement of our political system, that people are not demanding things because, after all, we're constantly misled about where the threats are coming from and what the possibilities are, and the way in which that's done is quite remarkable. I mentioned the destruction of the Maine in 1898 at the beginning of the hour, and perhaps 1 in 10 Americans have remembered the Maine today or know anything about what happened in those long ago days. But there is a remarkable novel by the late Gore Vidal called Empire, where he talks about class struggle and media as they existed at the time of the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century. And this is sort of history that people should become aware of, and most aren't. We've had interesting examples of that recently in the Oliver Stone films and book, and of course the classic here is the book of the late Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States. When people begin to look at this and begin to understand that what we have been seeing is a generation of vicious class struggle taking its rise in the 1970s, really, or a class struggle taking a new form. It always existed, taking a new form in the 1970s with the coming of neoliberalism, and we live at the tail end of this development. And the only way this situation, this massive and increasing, as you describe, poverty is going to change is when people demand it.
What's remarkable to me is the amount of indignation on the part of, well, especially poor whites, blue-collar, working-class people, which is directed down the social scale at the poor instead of up the social scale, which is where the rip-off occurs. And That's what they should be outraged about. But.
Yeah, and they need, we need ideas to understand how all this works, especially ideas about money and about debt. And that revolves around the nature of the financialization of the economy over the last 40 years, the increasing percentages of profits in the economy that are in the various financial sectors, banking and real estate and insurance and so forth. And for people to understand that the stock market isn't an act of nature. It's been invented by men, by very few men, to the benefit of the few, of the ownership class. We don't need to have our wealth in the stock market. We don't need to have that money in the stock market, which represents the surplus wealth of the society for investment in the future to the benefit of all. Should be understood that way. In one specific example, it's important to understand that when a union has its pension plan, invests its pension money in the stock market, the union is putting itself in the position of wanting the price of that stock to increase, meaning that that profit is taken from the wages of workers. So it seems to me at the level of those workers, white or otherwise, they need to understand what the choices are of what to do with their wealth that actually benefits the working class, instead of investing it in a way that in fact bets against themselves or against their wages.
There's some disturbing news this week on this front. We found that the numbers from the last quarter of the last year show that both Europe and Japan are contracting. Their economies are contracting. That is, they've fallen into recession. The notion that the United States can itself avoid this sort of recession is at least open to question. But given the world economy and the U.S. involvement is too weak a word, the U.S. efforts to control the world economy, the prospects are not bright at all, and the only way they can be redressed is by serious popular movements. We've seen some of this in the anti-austerity movements in Europe. We need anti-austerity movements in this country because the policy of the present government is austerity, even though they don't want to use the word. We heard from Mr. Obama last week in his State of the Union, this week in his State of the Union address, about all the things he was going to do for the middle class. What is actually happening to the middle class was described by Ron early on, and it's only when we realize that we're all in this together and that this is being done to us as a matter of conscious policy, not like a change in the weather, that other steps can be taken, a demand can be made, as Frederick Douglass suggested. But that's what's on the cards. That's what we've got to do in the near term. It's got to be done in terms of a demand. You're watching News from Neptune. We'll go to David Green. What's on your mind, David?
Well, what's on my mind is what Noam Chomsky would call the current crisis in the Middle East, which he always jokes about. He always has a paper ready in case, or a title ready,
right.
even if he's scheduled to give a talk 2 years into the future, which he probably does,
yep.
Or 3 or 5. I hope he's not scheduled out past 90, but in any event. He'll always say if they need a title even that far in advance, he'll put the current crisis in the Middle East, because he knows that yep. there will certainly be one. My comments today are just a few reflective and historical comments that I've been thinking about in lieu of an actual sort of news topic. If anything, the news topic is the recent election in Israel and the hubbub over it, and the sort of the denouement of that, which doesn't seem to amount to a whole lot. Very similar to that in our own country.
I was going to say, it sounds like elections elsewhere.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So it's sort of like what the main point I'm making. If you sort of want to shut it off right now and go do, it's getting to be 10:30. If it's past your bedtime, is that whatever excitement was generated about the election in this country, which proves to be sort of same old, is probably true in Israel itself, in spite of the fact that, as predicted, there was not, as predicted, a rise up of the religious settler movement or of the settler movement. There was instead a rise up of the sort of middle class, secular Israeli movement in the name of a TV newsreader. But the broader comments I want to make, just in sort of paralleling the American politics and Israeli politics, I think we can take these parallels very far back as we look at the last 25 or 30 years in terms of what's happened in Israel in relation to the occupation, what's happened with American involvement in the Middle East during that period of time. And I think the thing to point out is what Osama bin Laden said regarding the reasons, the purported reasons that they hate us. And back at the time of 2001, when American troops had been stationed in Saudi Arabia, in the Islamic country of Saudi Arabia, since the Gulf War the first Gulf War in '91. He also referred to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and he also referred to the sanctions on Iraq that had been ongoing through the 1990s and all the way up to our entrance into the war into Iraq 10 years ago that we're talking a lot about now in various phases. What about the parallel between Israel and the Israeli politics and U.S. politics? Well, Bill Clinton came into office in '93 as a liberal, allegedly as a liberal, and what he did, of course, was to secure NAFTA, an economically regressive program. And he also, among many other things, of course, continued to secure the sanctions against Iraq that had resulted from the first Persian Gulf War in 91. So at the same time, the famous Oslo peace accords were manufactured or were settled between the liberal Clinton administration, the Labor Rabin administration which had come to power in Israel after a relative absence for the previous 15 years when the Likud had first come to power in 1977. We go from there to find that the promise of the Oslo peace agreements were simply that the occupation would be normalized, that military checkpoints would be set up, that Palestinians would be prevented from going to war, gradually prevented and replaced from working the menial jobs within Israel itself, and that all would lead to the second Intifada in 2000, which began a year before, a little less than a year before the attacks on 9/11. That certainly resulted partly from, if one is to provide, Osama bin Laden with some credence in this context, the situation in Israel-Palestine, the ongoing situation in Iraq that was perpetuated by Clinton policies, and so. Long story short, as we move from over the last years of Democratic, Republican, Likudnik, Labor, however you want to look at it, in Israel, the United States itself, what we see are the politics of occupation, of Israeli occupation, the politics of the normalization of that, of the normalization of American occupation in the broader region, and the continued securing, of course, of the military relationship between the United States and Israel, all in the context, it has to be said, of the kind of neoliberal redistribution of wealth that occurs both in the United States, who's ever in power, and in Israel, who's ever in power. The economic significance of the alleged rise of the middle class in Israel. Analogous to that in this country is the concern of the middle class. There's a nice article by Nev Gordon this week about that, talking about how who it is, the kind of middle class anxieties that are represented by the party that made the greatest gains, led by a fellow named Yair Lapid. Not so much challenging the occupation or anything like that, but providing a voice, somewhat of a voice to those Israelis who are concerned that, given the increasing nature of poverty, the increasing nature of economic inequality, that there may not be a place for them and their children in the kind of Israel, the kind of relatively affluent Israel, which they have become accustomed to. So things change, things don't change, things stay the same. Politics in Israel and the United States, for the worse, kind of parallel each other, which are run parallel to each other, whatever the swings back and forth in the major political parties. And if anybody's looking, my last point, if anybody's looking for a kind of a silver bullet in a multi-party system, a parliamentary multi-party system in which one might think that the left, as it is in Israel, is relatively more officially represented, well, think again, it just doesn't really work that way. One doubts whether it would work that way in this country, even if we had a parliamentary system in which the Green Party or the Socialist Labor Party or whatever party was able to get a proportionate amount of seats. There's more fundamental issues than electoral issues in addressing these fundamental class conflicts.
Thank you, David. Comments, Ron?
No, that's been a relatively quiet theater recently, but the turmoil is still there. The latest scandal being the Israeli authorities apparently are sterilizing some of the black women who have immigrated there from Ethiopia and other places. And it's incredible that after all of the years of rants about racism, that anyone would stoop to this kind of thing.
Yeah, and you're referring to the Ethiopian Jews. There's a different issue with the refugees from Africa and the manner in which they've been treated in this kind of racist context. But you're referring to the Falasha Ethiopian Jews that are seen as kind of a threat. And Israel, again, a complicated country like our own with many different levels of racial and ethnic and class-based concerns that often get overlooked in the context of, the outer world and the occupation of Palestine. And just like identity politics in this country, which has never been stronger, is brought to the forefront, and in this context in which the fundamental neoliberal problems aren't being addressed, and Obama's laundry list about the middle class and immigration reform and gun control, even gun control, we talked about that last week. I'll go out on a limb in saying that's a bit of an identity politics issue also. I mean, it's much more than that, but,
As the late Alexander Cockburn pointed out, one of the few who did, that the world leader in the 20th century in sterilization politics is, of course, the United States, and that's recognized every place, but, of course, in the United States. And Israel is acting just as the 51st state in this regard. When the German leaders, when the issue was raised with German leaders at the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War, their response was, we were following American practice. This is what the Americans were doing. This is how we found out about it. This is the reason we set up our own sterilization programs here when we came into government in the 30s.
There was a big amount of enthusiasm for that in the early 20s in the USA.
And it went on from that. I'm embarrassed to note and feel that I have to, out of a sense of duty, that the classic academic study upon which the Supreme Court, the liberal Supreme Court, relied when they decided that 3 generations of imbeciles were enough, and therefore sterilization was allowable under Virginia law. The basic academic study was done by a distant cousin of mine, and so we should, when we're apologizing for things, we should realize that it literally is all in the family. You're watching News from Neptune. There are a good number of things that you raised here, David, that I want to comment on. You talked about NAFTA. The one thing we did here in the Clinton years, and the Democratic support for this corporate-friendly neoliberal enterprise, which has had such deleterious effects in Latin America, particularly in Mexico. The one positive, if that's the word, suggestion perhaps from the State of the Union speech was that the Obama administration wants to extend what's been called NAFTA on steroids, that is the Pacific free trade arrangement, wants to, an arraignment would be nice, it's an arrangement that they're working on. They want to extend that to the Atlantic, that he is talking about a free trade agreement with the EU. And we should remember here that free trade is a term of art that belongs in our Coburn's Corner that we'll talk about in a minute. Free trade means suspending local governmental regulations in order for corporations to act in an untrammeled fashion. That's what NAFTA produced in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the FPP is supposed to produce in the Pacific, and that's what Obama announced was being discussed between the U.S. and the EU right now. These are neoliberal programs of precisely the sort that produce that concentration of wealth and that impoverishment that Ron was talking about at the beginning of the hour. And here we have the Obama administration making that the centerpiece, the only specific suggestion, perhaps, of his State of the Union speech. So we know we're in the soup, eh?
Yeah, and it's important. Another reason why the free trade, as Noam Chomsky says, that terms like this have real meanings, what it might mean, and have ideological meanings, and there's always 2 meanings. And then what free trade, one of the most obvious reasons free trade is not free trade is it always comes with the enforcement of the patent and copyright laws that actually prohibit free trade, and gets enters into the whole problem of in capitalism of what are called rents, how much money we want to waste on paying for stuff much more than it actually costs. And in spite of all the rhetoric about free trade, our economy is incredibly burdened with patents and copyrights and other various restrictions on trade that raise the price of goods and therefore lower the wealth or make it more difficult for average people to attain or to maintain a decent standard of living and accumulate wealth. Now that doesn't mean that people shouldn't be paid for what they do, but I think what's along with many things that need to be understood about money and banking and the stock market, people understand again that patents and copyright laws aren't an act of nature. There are many ways to approach rewarding people for their work and providing incentives for work without exorbitantly rewarding their great grandchildren for what they produced in in the 1890s now, or what the great grandchildren of the future in terms of what is being produced now.
Thank you, David. I'll turn to one last theme here today, and that is the utter vacuousness of the State of the Union address. I doubt that if you went out on the streets, you could find 1 American in 10 who could remember anything that Mr. Obama said in his State of the Union address this week. It takes an effort and a lot of notes for me to bring up any of them at all. But I was interested in the responses to the State of the Union. And this, after all, the way the State of the Union address has worked out over the years is it really is an announcement of program on the part of the president. It was dismissed by one of his critics as a letter to Santa this week, but in fact, it's a step in that propaganda campaign we were talking about, where the presidency tries to make a case for what it's going to do anyhow. I mean, it is a propaganda exercise of the first order. It's, I think, revelatory of the vacuousness of American politics that the only thing people can remember about the Republican response to the State of the Union address is that Marco Rubio had to reach for a glass of water in the midst of it. Well, you know, we may have to reach for a good number of other things in order to get through it, but what he actually said has disappeared like the snows of yesteryear as David reaches for his glass of water. I wanted to draw attention, though, to the responses. There were other responses other than the official Republican response, one by the Libertarian Party and one by Rand Paul speaking for the Tea Party. There's also a response by Jill Stein of the Green Party presidential candidate, which actually got less play than Libertarian responses, if that's possible. It was harder to find what Ms. Stein said than it was to find what Senator Paul or the Libertarian party chairman had to say. I thought there were 2.5 good ideas in the Libertarian response, which was higher, certainly, than there was in the State of the Union address itself. And I quote those 2.5 good ideas. 1, repeal the failed and deadly war on drugs, leave people free so long as they harm no one else, restore our freedoms while dramatically reducing crime. Yea, verily. We've talked about that here before. 2, stop handing out subsidies to foreign dictators, stop engaging in foreign wars, ground the 3,000 drones that are flying around spying on Americans, bring our troops home out of harm's way, cut military spending, and promote peace. Now this is being said by these fringe parties, these parties that are being made fun of by the American political establishment. And the third, this is the half good idea. It goes back to what we talked about earlier. Cut taxes now, permanently, big, bold tax cuts that take money out of the hands of the politicians and return it to the men and women who earned it. Yes, and it has the problems we discussed a moment ago, including the need for a flat tax, the need for a redistributive tax, and that most, a guaranteed annual income tax is not necessarily redistributive. That's why I say a tax on wealth is necessary. We've talked here before about Tobin taxes, as they're called, taxes on financial transactions. These are not the things libertarians are speaking about, but they're at least on to the idea that we're taxed enough already, or rather, more appropriately, that the wrong people are being taxed. That's the half good idea. Rand Paul, in speaking for the Tea Party, or so he said, the senator from Kentucky, said essentially the same thing. He had the 2.5 good ideas too, but as I say, that's a remarkably high percentage given what was being offered by the State of the Union speech itself. If we had any serious politics in this country, we would have more serious debates, more serious criticisms of what Mr. Obama presented as an oratorical exercise this last week, one that really talked about the things this country needs in terms of taxes, war, and social programs as well. But unfortunately, I think we're not going to get it. We have a few minutes left here. I think we'll go to Coburn's Corner. I wanted to note that this is the point where we're in the spirit of the late Alexander Coburn. We talk about cliched political language and the obfuscation of political debate that takes place in this country by this resort to cliche. Ron had suggested the new normal as one a while ago. I think that's a good one, but it occurred to me that when David was talking about the current crisis in the Middle East, what he was also talking about was what our friends in Israel and in Washington want to make the new normal. That is, that system of occupation and control that is to be established as normal, whether we like it or not. So, yeah, and the new normal is doing a lot of work. You got another one for us this week, Ron?
Yeah, I want to mention the rise and fall of the term elitist that we used to hear so much about, but that dropped away, and we didn't hear much about it after the nomination of Mr. Romney, who is a multimillionaire. And you sometimes wonder what these people are talking about. Is it just income and wealth? Mr. Romney supposedly having wealth in excess of $250 million. So that arose when it was being used as a criticism of liberals, and then we didn't hear much about it at all for a while. It's coming back, though, in the criticism of Al Gore, who supposedly now is even wealthier than Mitt Romney, and so he's the elitist now. Susan Jacoby once wrote a nice piece about this whole notion of elitist. What it really means is the people who are best at anything, no matter what it is. So if you're the best tennis player, or one of the best, you're a member of the elite, and there are many, many kinds of elite, and I wonder if we can decontaminate that word. In some ways, I'm an elitist too, and so is everybody, but we would have to somehow disinfect that word, I hope, without killing it entirely, because it does have a legitimate use.
Yeah, I think the word needs to be reinfected. I mean, disinfected. No, it seems to me that one of the few contributions of the late lamented Occupy movement was to give us a meaning for that term. I mean, to speak of the 1%, as the Occupy movement did, was to point out that there was a fundamental contradiction of interest, not just a variation, but a contradiction of interest between the 1% and the 99%. And as was pointed out by many people, 1% is an overestimate. That is, in fact, it's smaller than 1%. The number of people in this country who actually control wealth and power through the financialized economy over the last generation. And that is an elite. The word is perfectly useful in that regard. And in order, it has to become visible in order for us to begin to complain about it. What we've got in this country is a tradition of saying, oh, these differences don't make too much difference. Anybody who wants to work hard, he can get into the elite if he wants, so forth and so on. As you pointed out not long ago, Ron, the European capitalist societies are in fact more open to talent, so to speak, than the American society is. Social mobility exists more in this country than there. But the remarkable stratification of the society is what we don't attend to. Once again, a point that you brought up with a chart not that long ago. Yeah. If Americans are asked about the distribution of wealth in this country, they say, yeah, it's a little uneven, and we'll make some suggestions about what it is, and they're wildly off from how bad it actually is.
They think they're living in Sweden, but they're
exactly. and America the United States is in fact the most unequal of the industrialized capitalist societies. But most Americans have bought has drunk the capitalist Kool-Aid and say, well, careers open to talents, things of that sort of stuff. So, hey, look, I want to reinfect elite. Let's bring that back.
Yeah, well, we still have the remnant of the Horatio Alger myth with us as
more than the remnants,
as Senator Rubio's speech showed.
There we go. Yeah. No wonder he needed a drink of water. Right. David, you got a contribution to the corner?
Pretty obvious one has to do with using the word hyphen-backed, such as Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Using the word using the word in a way that is obviously politically jaundiced. We rarely say is American-backed is Israel, but we do say Iranian-backed Syria or Iranian-backed Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. And so when one sees the word backed, I have seen the word backed used recently in a more sort of objective or sort of fair way, but still customarily it's been used against people that are designated enemies, that they are backed by Iran, which is the main enemy, and of course, with the nuclear test in North Korea this week, that all came into play. There's been a flurry of rhetoric about various things, and just remember who it is that we back and what we really do, and that's what's really important.
Has anybody attacked us as the Chomsky-backed News from Neptune? I'd hope so. I certainly would hope so. Well, hey, look, I mean, I may be putting words in Noam's mouth there, but, you know, and I don't know. Maybe that's a way. That's
I
a way
didn't know
to get
anyone
in.
was backing me.
The little beat means that we're backing up here.
Yeah, right.
That's right. You have been watching News from Neptune for the 7th week of 2013. Our program is in fact named in honor of Noam Chomsky, and this has been the War Lies edition on the anniversary of the destruction of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and of the greatest anti-war demonstrations in history in the year 2003. If our program has interested you, you might look for similar programs here at Urbana Public Television, now not only on cable, but streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Notably, Aware on the Air certainly, but notably Democracy Now!, which is seen every weekday morning here at 7 a.m., and The Big Picture every weekday morning at 8 a.m. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of this program will be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what's to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.